Something happens, a feeling appears, a reaction forms, a thought arrives. At first, it is only experience, a sensation in the body, a movement in attention, a shift in mood, a response taking shape. Simple, immediate, not yet personal. But this simplicity rarely remains. Very quickly, something is added, not just meaning, not just interpretation, identity. The experience is no longer felt as something happening. It begins to feel like something about you. Not sadness is here, but I am broken. Not fear is moving through the body, but I am weak. Not there is contraction, but this is who I am. This shift happens fast, so fast that it usually feels invisible. The experience appears, the mind interprets it, and almost immediately, the interpretation is absorbed into the sense of self. From that moment on, what was temporary begins to feel permanent. What was passing begins to feel defining. This is the moment most people do not see. Not the feeling, not the thought, not even the meaning, but the instant when meaning becomes identity. That instant changes everything. Because once experience becomes identity, it is no longer something you are meeting. It becomes something you believe yourself to be. And what you believe yourself to be is not observed in the same way. It is defended, protected, repeated. This is why certain experiences linger far longer than their actual intensity. The original sensation may be brief, but once it enters identity, it gains continuity. Now it can return as memory, as self-image, as expectation, as limitation. A single moment becomes a personal truth. A contraction becomes, "This is how I always am." A failure becomes, "This is what I am." A reaction becomes, "This is my nature." And because identity feels central, the mind stops questioning what has entered it. Thoughts can be questioned. Stories can be revised. Interpretations can be reconsidered. But identity feels deeper. It does not feel like an idea. It feels like fact. That is why the transition from experience to identity is so consequential. The moment something becomes me, the whole system reorganizes around it. Attention changes. Now you notice, whatever confirms the identity, memory changes. Now the past is recalled in ways that strengthen the self-image. Expectation changes. Now the future is anticipated through the shape of what you think you are. This is how identity stabilizes itself, not by force, by repetition, by selecting experience that fits the structure already formed. And because this happens so quickly, it feels natural. It feels obvious. Of course, this feeling means something. Of course, this reaction says something about me. Of course, this moment reveals who I am. But that, of course, is exactly what hides the process. Experience is one thing, identity is another. Between them, something subtle happens. A feeling is claimed. A reaction is personalized. A story is absorbed. And once that absorption occurs, the experience no longer feels open. It feels concluded. This is why people often suffer less from the original event than from what the event became inside identity. The sensation passes, the self-conclusion remains, the moment ends, the identity statement continues, and that continuation is what gives psychological pain so much durability, because the pain is no longer only being felt, it is being used to define the self. This is not done consciously. No one sits down and decides to become the feeling they are having. It happens through speed, through habit, through language, through the mind's need to stabilize experience by attaching it to something central. And nothing feels more central than me. This is why the movement is so persuasive. It promises coherence. It says, if this means something about me, then at least it makes sense. But sense is not freedom. Coherence is not truth. An identity formed too quickly is often only unexamined experience that was never allowed to remain temporary. This is where observation changes. The question is no longer, what am I feeling? And no longer even, what story is forming? The deeper question becomes, at what point did this become me? That question slows everything down. It reveals the point of capture, the instant when experience stopped being allowed to move through the system and was turned into a statement of self. Once that instant is glimpsed, identity becomes less solid. Not because it disappears, but because it is seen forming. And whatever can be seen forming can no longer feel entirely absolute. Once this is seen, the relationship with identity begins to change. Not because identity disappears, but because it is no longer felt as something that was always there. It is seen arriving, forming, closing, attaching itself to experience. That changes the weight of it. A feeling can still be intense. A thought can still appear. A story can still begin to form. But now, there is a difference between what is happening and what is being claimed. The sadness is there. The statement, "This is me," comes after. The fear is there. The statement, "This is what I am," comes after. That after is everything. Because once identity is seen as a movement rather than a fact, space returns. Not space to fix anything. Space to let experience remain temporary. A reaction no longer has to become a self-definition. A contraction no longer has to become a conclusion. An uncomfortable moment no longer has to become an identity statement. This is where something softens. The system does not need to hold the experience in the same way. It no longer has to build an entire self around it. And because it does not build, the experience moves differently, more simply, more cleanly, less psychologically. It is still felt, but it is not turned into a permanent shape. This does not produce some dramatic freedom. It is quieter than that. You begin to notice that many things were only becoming heavy because they were being personalized. Not because of their raw intensity, but because of what they were made to mean about the self. Once that movement is seen, the mind loses some of its urgency to conclude. Experience is allowed to remain experience for longer. And in that extra moment, identity does not close around it so quickly. That is enough. Enough for the feeling to pass without becoming a definition. Enough for the story to weaken before it becomes self-image. Enough for the system to learn that not everything it feels has to become me. This is not detachment. It is precision, seeing exactly where experience ends and self-conclusion begins. And once that line is visible, something important becomes possible. You can feel fully without becoming the feeling. You can experience something deeply without turning it into your identity. That is where the grip loosens. This is inner cognition.